Welcome back to XRP on Moon, and today's topic might completely change the way you look at your XRP holdings. What if I told you that holding just 2,000 XRP could potentially place you among a very small, elite group in the near future? And what if the collapse, or rather the planned evolution of SWIFT, isn't just a coincidence, but part of a much bigger financial reset already in motion? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't hype. It's a perspective built on patterns, institutional behavior, and the silent moves happening behind the scenes that most retail investors are still ignoring. Right now, the global financial system is undergoing a transformation that few truly understand. For decades, SWIFT has dominated cross-border payments. It's been the backbone of international banking, moving trillions of dollars across borders every single day. But here's the uncomfortable truth. SWIFT was never designed for the digital age. It's slow, expensive, and layered with inefficiencies that modern technology simply doesn't tolerate anymore. And while the public still sees SWIFT as untouchable, institutions have already begun preparing for what comes next. This is where XRP enters the conversation, not as just another cryptocurrency, but as a bridge asset designed specifically to solve the very problems SWIFT struggles with. We're talking about near-instant settlement, low transaction costs, and the ability to unlock liquidity globally without needing pre-funded accounts. These aren't small improvements. They are system-level upgrades, and when systems upgrade, those who are positioned early benefit the most. Now let's talk about that number, 2,000 XRP. At first glance, it might not seem like a life-changing amount, but in a future where XRP plays a central role in global liquidity, the supply shock could be unlike anything we've seen before. There are billions of people in the world, millions of institutions, and only a fixed supply of XRP. Once regulatory clarity fully arrives and institutional adoption accelerates, accumulation will no longer be a retail game. It will be a race dominated by entities with deep pockets. Think about how wealth transfers have happened historically, whether it was the early days of the internet, the rise of tech stocks, or even Bitcoin's initial run. The biggest gains always went to those who positioned themselves before mass awareness kicked in. By the time everyone understands the opportunity, the asymmetric advantage is already gone. And that's exactly why the idea of holding 2,000 XRP is being discussed more frequently. It's not about the number itself, but about being ahead of the curve. What makes this even more interesting is how quietly this shift is happening. Central banks are exploring digital currencies. Payment corridors are being restructured. Financial institutions are testing blockchain-based solutions behind closed doors. And while headlines may focus on volatility and short-term price action, the real story is unfolding at a much deeper level. It's about infrastructure, it's about control, and it's about who gets to participate in the next version of the financial system. The phrase "SWIFT's end was planned" might sound dramatic, but when you look at the timeline of innovation, it starts to make sense. Systems like SWIFT don't just disappear overnight, they are gradually phased out, replaced piece by piece until one day the old system becomes irrelevant. And during that transition period, new players rise. Technologies that were once dismissed suddenly become essential. XRP has spent years being criticized, challenged, and even legally tested, but in many ways, that pressure may have been necessary. Because once an asset survives scrutiny at that level, it becomes far more attractive to institutions that require certainty and compliance. And this is where things start to align. The need for a faster, more efficient system. The emergence of a digital asset built for that purpose, and a global shift that seems to be accelerating faster than most people realize. So when we talk about holding 2,000 XRP, we're not just talking about an investment, we're talking about positioning. Positioning yourself before the narrative fully shifts, before the demand outweighs the supply, before the average investor even understands what's happening, because by then, it may already be too late to enter at these levels. And here's the real question you need to ask yourself. If the financial system is truly evolving, and if XRP is even partially integrated into that evolution, what happens to those who ignored it? What happens when the opportunity was visible but dismissed as speculation? Because history doesn't reward hesitation, it rewards conviction backed by understanding. And right now we are at a point where the signals are there, but only for those willing to see them. This is just the beginning. Continuing from where we left off, the deeper question isn't just whether XRP can succeed, but whether the entire global financial structure is already being reshaped around technologies like it without the public fully realizing it yet. When people hear about SWIFT, they imagine a stable, unchanging system that quietly moves money behind the scenes. But in reality, SWIFT is not static. It is under pressure from every direction, especially from faster, cheaper, and more transparent blockchain-based alternatives. And this pressure is not theoretical anymore. It is already visible in pilot programs, partnerships, and institutional experiments happening across the world. To understand why holding 2000 XRP is being framed as elite in this discussion, you have to understand the concept of early positioning in financial transitions. In every major financial revolution, there is a phase where the asset or technology is still undervalued, misunderstood, and even criticized. During this phase, accumulation is quiet. Smart money builds positions without attracting attention. Retail investors, on the other hand, usually arrive when headlines confirm what institutions already knew years earlier. By that time, most of the exponential upside has already been captured. XRP sits in a very unique category because it is not just a speculative asset, it is designed as infrastructure for liquidity movement. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Infrastructure assets behave differently from hype-driven assets. They don't just rise based on sentiment, they grow based on integration. The more they are embedded into systems, the more valuable they become. And if XRP continues to position itself as a bridge between traditional banking and blockchain liquidity, then its value is not only tied to speculation, but to actual utility demand across global finance. Now think about Swift again, not as a brand, but as a system. Swift relies on multiple intermediaries, messaging layers, settlement delays, and correspondent banking relationships that are increasingly inefficient in a world that expects instant value transfer. Every inefficiency creates friction. Every friction creates cost, and every cost creates demand for a better solution. This is where distributed ledger technology becomes not just an option, but a necessity over time. The question is not whether the system will change, but who will be embedded into that change when it happens at scale. This is where the narrative around planned transition becomes important. Large financial systems don't collapse suddenly. They evolve through controlled upgrades. Old systems are slowly replaced by parallel systems until the new one becomes dominant enough that the old one is no longer required. In that transition window, early infrastructure providers become deeply integrated. If XRP continues to be one of those providers, then its role is not just as a tradable asset, but as a functional layer within global liquidity networks. Now, coming back to the idea of 2000 XRP, the significance here is psychological as much as it is mathematical. It represents a threshold that feels achievable for many retail investors today, but could become increasingly difficult to reach if global adoption expands. The reason is simple. As utility demand increases, supply available on exchanges tends to shrink. Long-term holders, institutions, and custodial services typically remove assets from circulation, reducing liquid supply. When demand rises while available supply falls, price discovery can accelerate much faster than most people anticipate. We also need to consider the role of institutional behavior in all of this. Institutions do not enter markets the same way retail investors do. They don't chase price spikes. They accumulate during periods of uncertainty and consolidation. They focus on long-term infrastructure alignment rather than short-term gains. So while retail sentiment may fluctuate based on news cycles, institutions are often building quietly in the background based on long-term strategic needs. And this is where the idea of being early becomes critical again. Early does not mean guessing correctly. It means positioning before confirmation becomes mainstream. In financial history, by the time something is universally accepted, its exponential growth phase is often already behind it. That is why discussions like holding 2000 XRP are less about the exact number and more about the mindset of accumulation before mass awareness fully sets in. At this stage, the real debate is not whether digital assets will play a role in global finance, but how deeply they will be integrated into it. And if XRP is part of that integration, then its long-term trajectory will not be driven by speculation alone, but by structural demand within the financial system itself. That is a very different kind of growth story, one that unfolds slowly at first, then rapidly once critical mass is reached. As we go deeper into this unfolding financial narrative, one of the most important concepts to understand is liquidity migration. This is not a term that usually appears in mainstream conversations, yet it sits at the core of how global money actually moves and evolves. Liquidity is the lifeblood of finance. It determines how easily value can flow between markets, institutions, and countries. And right now, that liquidity is slowly but steadily shifting away from older, fragmented systems toward faster, more efficient digital frameworks. For decades, SWIFT has acted as the messaging backbone for global payments, but it has never truly been the liquidity layer itself. Instead, it coordinates movement between banks that still rely on pre-funded accounts and correspondent relationships. This structure locks trillions of dollars in idle capital around the world, just waiting to be deployed across borders. That inefficiency has always been accepted because there was no real alternative at scale. But that reality is now changing as blockchain-based liquidity solutions enter the conversation. This is where XRP's role becomes significantly more interesting. Instead of relying on pre-funded accounts sitting idle in multiple jurisdictions, XRP has the potential to act as a bridge asset that allows value to move instantly between two different currencies or financial systems. In theory, this reduces the need for trapped liquidity and frees up capital that was previously locked in slow-moving settlement processes. When capital becomes more efficient, entire financial systems become more productive, and that efficiency is exactly what institutions are constantly searching for. Now, if we connect this back to SWIFT, the discussion becomes even more strategic. SWIFT itself is not disappearing overnight, but its dominance is being challenged by alternative settlement models that prioritize speed, cost efficiency, and interoperability. Financial institutions are not emotional about these changes. They are pragmatic. If a new system can reduce settlement times from days to seconds and significantly lower costs, it naturally becomes part of the long-term roadmap, and that roadmap is already being tested through various blockchain experiments and cross-border payment pilots globally. In this environment, XRP is often discussed as a potential liquidity bridge because it is designed for exactly that purpose: fast settlement, minimal friction, and global interoperability. While there are other technologies in the broader digital asset space, XRP's focus on payments and liquidity positioning gives it a very specific narrative compared to general-purpose cryptocurrencies. And narratives in finance matter because they influence where capital flows over time. Coming back to the idea of holding 2,000 XRP, we need to understand it not as a magical number, but as a representation of early-stage positioning in a system that is still developing. If global liquidity systems evolve in the direction of tokenized settlement and blockchain-based bridging mechanisms, then assets that are integrated into those systems could experience exponential demand shifts. In such a scenario, the early accumulation phase becomes extremely important because once institutional participation accelerates, available supply in the open market can decrease rapidly. It is also important to recognize how slowly these transitions appear at first. For years, technological revolutions often look like they are moving too slowly or even failing. But underneath that surface, infrastructure is being built, tested, and refined. Payment corridors are being upgraded, compliance frameworks are being adjusted, and interoperability standards are being discussed at institutional levels. By the time these changes become visible in price action or mainstream news, the foundational shift is often already well underway. Another key factor is trust. For any system to replace or complement SWIFT, it must meet extremely high standards of reliability, security, and regulatory compatibility. This is where many blockchain projects struggle, but it is also where assets like XRP have spent years trying to position themselves. Regulatory clarity, legal scrutiny, and institutional partnerships all play a role in determining whether a digital asset can transition from speculation to infrastructure. And infrastructure is where long-term value tends to concentrate. So when we talk about liquidity migration, we are really talking about a silent but powerful redistribution of financial efficiency. Money is not just moving between accounts. It is moving between systems, between technologies, and between eras. And in that transition, early infrastructure participants often benefit disproportionately because they become embedded in the new flow of value. One of the most decisive forces shaping the future of global finance is institutional adoption. This is the stage where ideas stop being theoretical and start becoming operational. Institutions do not adopt technology because it is popular. They adopt it because it solves real, expensive problems at scale. And when it comes to cross-border payments, settlement efficiency, and liquidity management, the inefficiencies in the current system are no longer small issues. They are massive cost centers that institutions are actively trying to eliminate. For years, the traditional financial system has relied on layers of intermediaries, legacy messaging systems, and delayed settlement structures that were built in a pre-digital era. These systems were once considered reliable, but in today's world of instant communication and global connectivity, they are increasingly seen as outdated. That is why banks, payment providers, and financial networks have been quietly experimenting with blockchain-based solutions, not as a replacement overnight, but as an upgrade path toward a more efficient financial architecture. This is where XRP's narrative becomes tightly connected to real-world institutional needs. Instead of focusing on speculation or short-term trading behavior, institutions focus on utility, specifically whether an asset can reduce friction in liquidity movement and settlement. XRP's design as a bridge asset allows it to potentially connect different currencies and payment systems without requiring pre-funded accounts in every corridor. This is important because it directly addresses one of the biggest inefficiencies in global banking: trapped capital. Now, when people hear discussions like SWIFT's end was planned, it is important to understand it in the correct context. It does not mean SWIFT disappears suddenly or fails overnight. Instead, it refers to a gradual evolution where new systems are introduced alongside existing ones, slowly absorbing functions until the older system becomes less central. This type of transition has happened in every major technological shift, whether it was telecommunications, internet infrastructure, or digital banking systems. The old system doesn't vanish. It gets replaced by something faster, cheaper, and more scalable. In this environment, regulatory clarity becomes one of the most powerful catalysts. Institutions cannot fully commit to new financial infrastructure unless there is legal and regulatory certainty. Uncertainty creates risk, and risk slows adoption. That is why regulatory developments around digital assets are so closely watched. Once compliance frameworks are established and legal clarity improves, it opens the door for larger capital flows, custodial solutions, and integration into existing banking systems. This is the point where institutional participation can move from experimental to structural. If XRP continues to align itself with compliant payment solutions and global liquidity frameworks, then its role becomes increasingly relevant in a modernized financial system. But the key point here is not just technology, it is timing. Even the best infrastructure cannot deliver its full value until the system around it is ready to integrate it. That is why these transitions often appear slow at first and then suddenly accelerate once a critical threshold is reached. This brings us back again to the idea of holding 2,000 XRP. In a purely numerical sense, it is just a quantity, but in a systemic sense, it represents early positioning before widespread adoption potentially reshapes demand dynamics. If institutional usage increases and liquidity demand expands across global corridors, the available circulating supply on public markets could become significantly tighter. When supply tightens and demand increases simultaneously, price discovery can accelerate rapidly. We have seen similar patterns in past financial revolutions. Early internet companies, cloud computing infrastructure, and even digital payment systems all went through phases where adoption looked slow, uncertain, or even controversial. Yet those who understood the long-term direction of change and positioned early often benefited the most when mainstream adoption finally arrived. The same principle applies here, but with one major difference. Global finance is one of the largest and most rigid systems in the world, meaning once it starts shifting, the impact is significantly larger. Another important layer is interoperability. The future of finance is not likely to be dominated by a single system, but by interconnected networks that can communicate seamlessly. In that world, assets that can act as bridges between different financial ecosystems become more strategically valuable. This is why the concept of liquidity bridging is so central to XRP discussions. It is not just about replacing existing systems, it is about connecting them more efficiently. So as we look at institutional adoption, regulatory progress, and the modernization of global payments, the picture becomes clearer. The financial system is not standing still. It is evolving quietly, step by step, toward a more digitized and efficient structure. And in that evolution, assets that are aligned with real-world utility and institutional needs tend to gain long-term relevance. Everything we have discussed starts to connect into a single bigger picture. Liquidity migration, institutional adoption, regulatory clarity, and the gradual evolution of legacy systems like SWIFT are not isolated events. They are interconnected movements within a global financial transformation. And when you step back and look at it from a wider perspective, it becomes clear that we are not just talking about a single asset like XRP. We are talking about the restructuring of how money itself moves across the world. The traditional financial system was built in a time when speed was limited, communication was slower, and trust required multiple layers of verification. SWIFT became the global messaging standard because it worked for its time. But the world has changed. Today, value moves digitally, markets operate 24/7, and institutions demand near-instant settlement with minimal friction. This creates a natural tension between old infrastructure and new technological capabilities. And over time, that tension forces evolution. What makes this transition particularly important is that it is not driven by speculation. It is driven by necessity. Financial institutions are not exploring blockchain and digital assets because it is trendy. They are doing it because inefficiencies cost real money. Trillions of dollars in liquidity are locked globally in outdated settlement structures, and unlocking even a fraction of that inefficiency represents enormous economic value. This is the kind of pressure that drives systemic change. In this environment, XRP is often positioned as a bridge asset that can facilitate faster, more efficient cross-border liquidity movement. Whether or not every speculative claim about the future materializes, the core idea remains focused on solving a real-world problem: how to move value across borders instantly without relying on pre-funded accounts and slow intermediary chains. That use case alone places it within a very specific category of financial infrastructure technologies rather than purely speculative digital assets. Now, bringing back the concept of holding 2000 XRP, it is important to understand what that represents in this broader narrative. It is not about guaranteeing outcomes or predicting exact prices. Instead, it symbolizes early alignment with a potential structural shift in global finance. In every major transformation, there is always a phase where participation is relatively accessible, followed by a phase where adoption accelerates and entry becomes more competitive. Those who position themselves during the early phase often benefit from the compounding effects of long-term system integration. However, it is equally important to stay grounded in reality. Financial systems do not change overnight, and no single asset operates in isolation from broader macroeconomic forces, regulation, or technological competition. There are multiple players, multiple technologies, and multiple outcomes that can shape the future of global payments. That is why understanding risk, uncertainty, and timing is just as important as understanding opportunity. We are also entering an era where interoperability will define the next generation of financial networks. Instead of one system replacing another completely, we are likely to see a combination of legacy infrastructure and new digital rails working together. In that scenario, the value shifts towards systems that can connect different networks efficiently, bridging liquidity, reducing friction, and enabling seamless settlement between currencies and institutions becomes the core function of next-generation financial infrastructure. As this transition unfolds, one of the biggest challenges for individuals is not just identifying opportunity, but recognizing timing. Being early can feel uncertain, even uncomfortable. Being late can feel safe, but often limits upside potential. The balance between conviction and caution becomes critical, especially in markets undergoing structural change. That is why education, awareness, and long-term thinking matter more than short-term reactions. So when we step back and reflect on everything, from Swift's evolving role to the rise of digital liquidity solutions, the key takeaway is not certainty, but positioning. Global finance is shifting towards speed, efficiency, and digital settlement layers. Whether XRP becomes a central component of that system or simply one of several supporting technologies, the direction of change is already underway. And finally, before we end this discussion, a necessary disclaimer. This content is for educational and informational purposes only and should not be considered financial advice. Cryptocurrency and digital asset markets are highly volatile and risky. Always do your own research, consider your financial situation carefully, and consult with a licensed financial advisor before making any investment decisions. Thank you for watching this breakdown on XRP on Moon.